The Applied Physics Lab is known for weapons and spacecraft research. But what takes place at their Warfare Analysis Laboratory are virtual war games involving the highest ranks of the Pentagon, military, and the national intelligence community. It was there in 2009 that the Pentagon recruited me to create the first currency war simulation ever held.
So why is a currency war now on the Pentagon's radar?
Simply put, America has become virtually undefeatable in direct military conflicts, especially in what the military calls 4CI. That's because we spend $711 billion a year on our military budget, 41% of what the entire world allocates to their armed forces. Frankly, there's not an aircraft carrier we can't sink or an army we can't defeat. And conventional terrorism, while absolutely dangerous, is not on the same scale as a large nation's army. So what's happening is that rival nations and terrorist organizations are developing capabilities in unconventional warfare. Things like cyber warfare, biological or chemical warfare, and now financial weapons of mass destruction, like currencies, stocks, derivatives, sovereign wealth funds, energy, even gold. This is my specific area of expertise. And the United States military has come to the conclusion that our nation is completely unprepared for a full-blown assault on our economy.
So how did the Pentagon come around to identifying you to be the person to create this currency war scenario?
It wasn't an overnight decision. I began my career in the international division of Citibank, which stationed me in some dangerous places like Lagos, Nigeria, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, all over the Middle East. My experience with Middle Eastern financing in particular is what caught the attention of the national intelligence community. So after 9/11 struck, I was asked by high-ranking CIA members to look into suspicious insider trading activity that took place prior to the attack. That was my first assignment with the national intelligence community, and over the years, I've worked with the Pentagon and Defense Department to develop measures for using capital markets to predict potential terrorist threats. The recession was a wake-up call to the U.S. military and our intelligence community. They saw with complete clarity that we had an easy-to-exploit weakness in our financial markets, one that is just as dangerous as a conventional attack from an enemy. In a sense, an enemy aggressor could launch a financial Pearl Harbor on us, which the United States would be totally unprepared for and would have very little defense against. And the ripple effect from that could wreak havoc throughout our society as trillions in wealth is lost and the dollar is decimated.
What is a currency war?
Great question. I built the currency war simulation around an unconventional attack. This way the Pentagon could prepare for the extreme scenario. But in its most basic form, the one that is historically the most common, a currency war breaks out when nations begin to intentionally devalue their currency against each other to help boost their economies. The flawed logic goes like this. If you make your currency cheaper, that makes your exports cheaper. It also theoretically makes your country more appealing to foreign investments, since foreign currencies now buy more inside your borders. And the powers that be figure that'll solve a floundering economy. History has shown this not to be the case time and time again. What devaluing your currency also does is make the debt you repay to other countries cheaper. This angers the people you owe money to.
With America $16 trillion in the hole, it's easy to see why that would be an attractive option to some folks in Washington.
Exactly. It's become apparent Washington's plan is to intentionally weaken the dollar. The problem is, once one country devalues their currency, soon after, other countries do it in retaliation.
So am I correct in assuming you believe America is on the brink of another full-scale currency war?
I think it's already begun. It's the third global currency war in history, and the devastation could be almost immeasurable. The outcome of conventional currency wars always result in stagnation, inflation, austerity, and financial panic. Now, when you are dealing with currency wars, the only good guys are the innocent civilians in America and the other countries whose governments are waging this war, because they will be the ones to get hurt by dangerous inflation, unstable and volatile investment markets, and the complete loss of financial security. To put it plainly, this intentional currency debasement will destroy the dollar and your wealth. And that's the best case scenario. In a worst case scenario, you've got a global Great Depression, as well as international turmoil that could escalate to military conflicts. Or you could have chaos erupt if a terrorist organization or some unstable dictator decides today is the day to bring down the financial markets. But currency wars can also lead to actual war, world wars. There were two currency wars that took place in the 20th century. The first one occurred from 1921 to 1936, between World War I and World War II. After World War I had ended, Germany owed $33 billion in reparations. That's roughly $400 billion today. Well, to help pay off that figure, they started printing obscene amounts of money. This caused the Weimar hyperinflation epidemic, where a wheelbarrow full of printed money got you a loaf of bread. In retaliation, France and the United States began intentionally devaluing their currencies during this period. This led to the French franc collapsing. But three outcomes stand out from this currency war. One, Germany's hyperinflation helped fuel Hitler's rise, which directly led to World War II, because economic chaos leads to extreme movements in a society. 2, the United States' role in this currency war became a large catalyst for the Great Depression and FDR's brazen gold confiscation from American citizens. And 3, in Japan, a dangerous military faction took control of the government. Like in Germany, an extreme movement took over. And while it's not a straight line, this indirectly led to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Second Currency War began in 1965 when France's President, Charles de Gaulle, converted $150 million in his country's reserves into gold, the equivalent of about $7 billion today. And he threatened to convert another $150 million shortly after. Spain decided to follow on France's heels and converted $60 million into gold. This helped cause the collapse of the London gold pool, which put the stability of the global financial system into jeopardy. And that allowed the IMF to create a new form of international currency called a special drawing right. You may be hearing a lot about this in the near future as nations continue to demand a replacement for the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Now, a few years later, as the competitive devaluations kept going back and forth, President Nixon, on a Sunday evening in 1971, stated,
"I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators."
And on that day, the gold standard died. But on that broadcast, Nixon also announced that he was levying an instant 10% tax on imports. The fallout from this speech would become known as the Nixon shock, and it started a chain reaction of skyrocketing unemployment, an oil crisis, a crashing stock market, and runaway inflation that lasted through Carter's presidency and into Reagan's. The United States suffered through 3 recessions from 1973 to 1981. To end this second currency war, President Reagan and Paul Volcker had to institute some very difficult interest rate hikes, but the damage was done. Right now, we're locked in a conventional currency war with China, Europe, and most of the world. I believe the U.S. government is also actively at war with our dollar, and as a dangerous consequence, the wealth of its citizens. Because when you simultaneously make the dollar weaker, lower interest rates, and unsustainably grow the federal debt, you are robbing Americans of their financial security. This is what I testified before the Senate about.
Can you walk me through how this third currency war began?
It took a perfect storm, really. We've been aggressively acquiring more and more debt for decades now. But since 9/11, it's really sped up. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost about $4 trillion. And Presidents Bush and Obama's loose spending policies have done us no favors. Plus, the United States trade imbalance with the rest of the world has been getting worse and worse. This bottomed out in 2008, right as our dollar was surging, while we were in the midst of the most dangerous economic downturn since the Great Depression. The perfect storm had arrived. And that's when Washington foolishly decided that a currency war was the best cure for the recession. They obviously didn't learn from Germany during Currency War I. So to stop the dollar in its tracks, the Federal Reserve began this war when they printed trillions of dollars while enacting their multiple quantitative easing gambles.
There's been a lot of talk about China attacking America's economy over the years. But are you saying we fired the first shots?
Absolutely. The evidence is in the numbers. In 1997, the U.S. trade deficit with China was less than $50 billion. It's closing in on $300 billion a year now. Now you've got China with all these extra dollars they've collected from us. So what did they do with it? They bought a great deal of treasuries. So faced with an insurmountable disadvantage in trade and a growing superpower that has stockpiled our debt, what does the United States do? Print a lot of money and push out the quantitative easing programs. The purpose of these maneuvers wasn't just to jumpstart the American economy. That's just the cover story. QE1 ran from late November of 2008 all the way up through the end of March of 2010. The Fed created about $1.3 trillion out of thin air with that move, and the dollar was weakened by as much as 21%. But this wasn't good enough. So in November of 2010, they rolled out QE2, which ran all the way through the end of June 2011, flushing another $600 billion through the system. The dollar bottomed out 10% lower during this run. Then came the $400 billion Operation Twist in October of 2011, which carried well into 2012. Now, during this stage of the currency war, the Fed has also printed an additional $1.9 trillion, a 24% increase to our money supply. So that's about $4 trillion of our funny money that's flooded the global markets and weakened our dollar by as much as 27%. That means round one of this currency war caused average Americans to become victims from the Fed covertly eradicating over a quarter of the value of their life savings and investments. At one of my Treasury briefings, I even warned that Ben Bernanke's dollar-weakening policies could be more dangerous to our economy and the national security of the United States than al-Qaeda.
You've established that we're the aggressors in this currency war. With that said, How can our, for lack of a better word, our enemies, how are they retaliating?
Since we opened up that QE can of worms, countless other nations have retaliated by unleashing their own quantitative easing measures on us. Not including the United States, $4 trillion was printed by world governments last year from global quantitative easing. And what's broken out is inflation all across the international community. We specifically exported a massive amount of it to China on our own. Their money supply has grown about 19% a year over the last decade. Not exactly a model for stable China-U.S. relations. Quantitative easing delivered calculated strikes to the financial security of many nations and their citizens. This currency war has played a big part in food prices rising about 148% and energy prices 468% over the last decade. This is happening around the world, not just here.
You've mentioned the U.S. is exporting inflation to China. What is China doing to defend itself during this currency war?
I think they're playing the long game. They absolutely want to bring down the dollar and replace it with the yuan in the global economy. They've said this publicly. And I believe, as do many...
So James, let me see if I'm getting this right. This currency war has two levels. The first concerns the conventional threats, where you have aggressors like the Federal Reserve. And they're waging a war on other countries, and average Americans, they're devaluing the dollar, printing money, and enacting one quantitative easing measure after another. And then in retaliation, those countries devalue their currency against us. They're pushing out their own quantitative easing. They're printing their own money, and they're attacking the wealth of their own citizens. Now this back and forth will lead to dangerous inflation. Decimated currencies and the loss of trillions of dollars of wealth for folks all across the country and the world for that matter. But the second level of this currency war, this really concerns the unconventional threats, the financial weapons of mass destruction, right?
That's correct. I realize this is a very complex subject, so let me put it this way. We've all seen the movie Casablanca. It's centered around Rick's Cafe, a place where intelligence could be traded, deals were struck, enemies gathered together, and all kinds of treachery could take place behind the scenes. I look at global financial markets as one big Rick's Cafe. Every day, Iranian provocateurs, oil sheiks, Russian hitmen, Saudi arms dealers, and average American investors do business with each other without even knowing it. The Strait of Hormuz is strategically the most important oil route on the planet. 35% of all oil that is carried across the sea, and more than 31,000 ships travel through here each year. Many of them are the warships and submarines of the U.S. Navy and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now just imagine if Iran shuts off the Straits of Hormuz and blocks over 1/3 of the oil on the ocean from reaching its destination. Think about what that would do to oil prices, and as a side effect, gold and food prices. It's a powerful and politically sensitive card the Iranians can play in this currency war. Even if the Strait of Hormuz isn't closed off, we need to worry about the bond Iran and China have formed lately. We know China wants to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And since international oil transactions are settled in dollars, what better way to rebel against this and make a strong statement than to buy your Iranian oil with Chinese yuan? But China brought Russia into the fold too by moving the yuan they used to buy Iranian oil through Russian banks. And it's a lot of money, about $20 to $30 billion a year. So right there you have Iran, China, and Russia teaming up to weaken the dollar's influence.
That's a dangerous trio of countries working together like that. You had mentioned earlier at the Applied Physics Lab that you thought that China was secretly stockpiling gold. Why do you think that?
Because they've done it before. From 1977 through 2000, China's gold reserves sat at 395 metric tons. Then after 9/11, their reserves spiked to about 600 tons. Then from 2002 through 2008, they stayed at this level, or so we thought. In 2009, without anybody having an early warning, even the intelligence community, China unveiled gold reserves of 1,054 tons. That was right as the first waves of this currency war began to heat up. How can China secretly get that much gold that quickly into their reserves without sounding any alarms? The answer is simple. They are treating the acquisition of gold like it's a military mission. China has become the #1 gold producer, and they are doing this by purchasing mines all over the